Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending the webinar this afternoon. My name is Melissa Schwartz, and I'm the manager of the education team here at TrainingPeaks. I also have Sean Hygen joining me from TrainingPeaks to help out with some of the questions that come in throughout the course of the webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping things to get taken care of before I hand it over to Eric. If you have questions as Eric is presenting, go ahead and submit them through the question box. Please don't wait until the very end while he's actually doing questions and answers. Go ahead and ask them while he's presenting. Sean and I will be answering some of them, and then we'll also be keeping some for the end for Eric to read and answer out loud. Also, we are recording this, so we will be uploading it to YouTube either later today or at some point tomorrow. We'll send an email out with that YouTube link. And Eric is also going to show 2 files in his presentation. So in that email that goes out, we're going to provide a link to those 2 files. So if you guys are watching it again, you'll have access to those files. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric, and he's talking about the methods and tools for training in the winter.
Thanks, Melissa. Just pull this up and get started. So the biggest thing that people always want to hear about is what to do in the wintertime, even what to do in the fall when they first get started back into their training. And that can definitely be, just by the sheer number of people that we have on today, this topic is obviously a really hot one. So, and one of the main reasons is we're very crunched for time in the winter. Most of the people, we live in snow states where it's cold, it gets dark really early, and we simply have much less time in the winter to train than we do in the summer. This also becomes a much bigger problem when the standard periodization, this old school method of training of doing a lot of volume at a very low intensity, which you're supposed to do early in your training in the winter when you have less time, doesn't really work with each other. It's kind of conflicting. And so I'm going to talk about 2 general areas. We're going to talk about 2 specific things that you can use and incorporate into your training in the wintertime to just help you maximize your time. The first thing we're going to talk about is how to find our weaknesses, and we're going to talk a little bit on how to train them. We're going to talk about the science versus the real world, how to use both the numbers and the science part to find your weak areas, and then also what the real world tells you about finding your weak areas as well. The next part we're going to do is we're going to talk about endurance training, okay? And people use the term base training a lot, and base training should really, somewhere along the line, the term base got switched from defining a period of time into defining a type of training. And it should really be used to define a period of time. You can call it base training, you can call it foundation training, whatever you like. Winter training. The bottom line is there should be many different components into that foundation or base training, and endurance is one of them. So we're going to talk about endurance training. We're going to help define endurance training for you, and we're going to talk about how you can maximize the amount of time that you have, the limited amount of time that you have to get as much endurance adaptation as possible. So first things first, finding and training your weak areas. Most of the time, people go about just trying to discover these weak areas incorrectly. And so one of the things I hear a lot is I always get dropped in criteriums, so I must be bad at crits, or I must be a bad sprinter because I can never do well in a criterium. Or the thing I hear a lot from triathletes is the run is horrible. I'm always getting passed on the run, so I must be a bad runner. So I need to do more of that. And while those are good points, those lack a little bit of scientific backing. And one of the main things the main thing you should get from trying to find your weakness, the couple of things I'm going to talk about, is you want several different data points to determine what your weak area is, first of all. Not simply, you know, I did one triathlon, I had a bad run, so I'm a horrible runner. We want to have several different data points all pointing towards one area to really confirm that something is actually a weak area. So the first thing is a power profile. This is Coggins' power profile here, which many people have seen. And they also have one on TrainingPeaks that does all of this funky math for you, which is really nice, and I'll bring that up here. And the nice thing about the power profile is it compares an athlete to themselves. So you can forget about the world-class athlete and the Cat 3. I kind of generally don't even look at those. But obviously we can do, there's different data points here for each section. There's a 5-second power output, there's a 1-minute power output, a 5-minute power output, which is going to be kind of equivalent to your VO2 power. And then there's a 20-minute power and a 1-hour maximum power output. And the nice thing about using a power profile, whether you use this one on TrainingPeaks here that does all the math for you, or you calculate it yourself right here in terms of watts per kilogram of body weight. This is all done in your maximal power output and your body weight, is that it compares you to you. So obviously you can do more power for 5 seconds than you can for 1 hour. And what this power profile does is it calculates all of these, saying that if you can do this wattage for 5 minutes, so this is actually my dashboard on TrainingPeaks, is if you can do 320 watts for 5 minutes, then 278 watts for 20 minutes is pretty equivalent. You're a well-balanced rider. Okay, obviously you could do more power for 5 minutes than you could for 20. So that is a really nice thing to figure out which area is weak. Now you can see here this 1-minute power output is a little low for me. So that would indicate that this area is weaker. And you can see these bars here, these numbers are pretty well balanced. In other athletes you might see larger discrepancies. You might see really high 5-second power output, lower threshold power that we get from the 20-minute power output or the 1-hour power output. Now, the key thing with using a power profile, and this is something that is very important, and a lot of people kind of don't do this correctly. These numbers, you're not going to get accurate numbers that represent you as an athlete by accident. These numbers you have to get through testing or some kind of maximal effort when you are rested. You're not going to go ride with your buddies and have a conversation and accidentally PR in a 20-minute power output. So all of these numbers have to be either from a race or from a testing scenario to get accurate numbers. Don't just say, oh, the first 5 minutes of my 30-minute threshold test that I did was the best one I have, so I'm going to use that. It's got to be a standalone test that you want to do. And that way you're just going to get more accurate numbers. This power profile is not going to be accurate just by accident. None of these numbers up here for myself have been any kind of test or maximal effort. And this is in the last 90 days. So that's an important thing to note, that you want to make sure that you're doing proper testing or you're getting these from a race. Also, if you're using this on TrainingPeaks, the numbers that they use here are average power outputs. So especially for the roadies out there, if you're getting some of these record numbers from a group ride or a bike race, you're going to want to go to that actual workout and see what your normalized power output is, because it's going to be higher, especially if it's in a group ride or some kind of race. So that power profile is a really good way to start this analysis of which is weaker. Is my maximum power output weaker, or is my threshold power output weaker? And that is, if it's used correctly, it can be very, very accurate. Again, you've got to do the testing. Okay, you really want to make sure that you use that accurately. The next thing you can look at is what I mentioned before. Look at those race results. Okay, compare yourself to your competition, compare yourself to your friends or your teammates, And the reason I say friends or teammates is because if you're just out training, you can hopefully get a more honest assessment from a friend or a teammate. Maybe they'll share a power file with you, etc. Race results are very important. I would look at race results over a whole year if possible and look for those big trends. There are times when people who have terrific sprinting power and terrific sprinting ability, big 5-second power outputs don't do well in criteriums. Why? There's something that's not quite right there because of that discrepancy. But the thing that you want to do, the thing that we're really looking for with using the power profile, looking at race results, seeing how you compare to your friends or your other competition, is we're looking for a lot of data points, as I just mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier. And what we want to do is you want to keep asking yourself why. Okay. Another big thing that I've found to be true time and time again with finding and training weak areas is that I have written down right here, any weakness that is weak enough will hold everything back. And so we've all heard the phrase, the term, train your weaknesses, race your strengths. A lot of times we get people that will focus on training what they need to use in the race, and long-distance triathletes are very, very guilty of this because they're probably some of the most time-crunched athletes out there, where they really focus on a lot of endurance training. They don't do any top-end training, and they have a big, big weakness in their maximum power output and their 5-minute power output. And we think, well, that's okay because they don't need that in their race, and that's true. Those athletes can have a bigger discrepancy between something like their threshold power and their maximum power output. But the thing that we found is that even if that maximum power output is too low, if that weakness is weak enough, it will still hold back everything. And we've done this time and time again with countless athletes where we improve a weakness, especially if it's a really, really big one, whether it's race specific or not, and everything else improves. We even had some examples of some road cyclists that they had a weak area of kind of a weak 5-second power output. It wasn't even that weak. It wasn't even that big of an issue, just a little bit too weak. And it wasn't even race specific. They were working more, they were focusing on the Tour of the Gila, longer road races and time trials. We improved their max power, made them a more kind of complete, more dynamic rider overall. Everything improved. Their race results improved, their time trialing improved, their riding improved, everything. And why did that happen? Well, it kind of gets into this next part. When you start thinking that you have an idea of what your weakness is, you want to keep asking why, okay? Why are you getting passed on the run in your triathlon? Why are you getting dropped on all of the hills? Is it really because you're a bad runner, or is it really because you don't have the power to weight ratio to keep up with the good climbers? Or is it because that hill that you're getting dropped on all the time is at the end of a race and you're simply lacking the endurance so that you're too fatigued by the end of the race to keep up? This is a big one that we see with criterium riders that have a great sprint. The crit is very, very hard. There might be a little hill in it. It'll be windy. It's a hard, nonstop race, not a lot of time to recover, and it doesn't matter how good their sprint is because they can't even get up to the front of the race when it comes time for them to unleash their strength. That weakness is too weak, and it's holding them back. So keep asking yourself why so that you can really get down to the very specific aspect of what is weak. And that leads us into trying to separate skills from your power output or your engine. Sometimes when I do a seminar on power zones and threshold, I talk about each individual training zone, your threshold, tempo, endurance, VO2 zone as a different physiological engine that you have. So you can think of them in that sense. And this is something that I get from roadies all the time. And you have to separate the physical power output, the physical exertion part, with the skill. So time trialing is a skill, okay? Climbing is a skill. 3 minutes all out to the finish line is an intensity. So when you say, oh, I'm bad at climbing, I get dropped on hills, well, what kind of hills is it? Are you getting dropped on shorter hills, longer hills? Okay, there are a lot of people, especially the criterium riders, will find that they can participate, and they're more competitive at those shorter hills, 1, 2, 5-minute hills even, and they can even repeat those over and over again. But when that climb gets up to 20, 30 minutes, an hour long, or when you're doing those 10, 15-minute repeated climbs, that's where they start to struggle. That's going to, so remember, that's an intensity. So this way you can say it's not necessarily that you're bad at climbing, it's that you're bad at those long climbs. You're bad, you need to improve on that threshold power. You need to improve that endurance. So if you find that you're bad, that you have trouble competing in the longer climbs, go back to that power profile, see where that threshold power is compared to the max power, the 1-minute power, and you're probably going to find that they're going to start to match up. So every skill has a particular engine or an exertion level within its particular race situation. So you want to try to separate those out. That'll help you train those better. And there's a lot of examples that I can get into with this. And I'm still a road cyclist. I was a road cyclist for 10 years, and when I moved to doing more triathlon, I would go to a bike race, and some of my friends would say, "Oh, you must be a great time trialist now. You're gonna beat everybody in the time trial." And that's not true at all. I've always been good at the act of time trialing, at pacing myself, but the people that beat me can put out more power, and now the road cyclists can put out even more power than they used to compared to me. So I do even worse in time trialing. I'm not a better time trialist. So there's a power there and there's a skill there. So don't generalize. A lot of times you see people, they get dropped on long hills, so they're like, oh, I'm a bad hill climber, and they go out and do hill repeats, which is great, but they're doing 2-minute hill repeats, 5-minute hill repeats. They're working the wrong energy zone. So if you can break apart the things that you're bad at and the skill versus the energy zone, which power output you're at, then you can kind of dial in a little more focused onto that weak area. And there's some examples here on how to train that stuff. And what you want to do with all of these examples is we're becoming less specific. So if you're getting dropped at climbing, don't ride hard, but just ride uphill. You could do more standing. You could do some higher cadence work on the hill to stimulate attacks. You could do some more low cadence work to simulate the lower cadences that you generally ride in when you're riding uphill. The same thing with sprinting. If your max power output is low, go ahead and do those maximum effort sprints. Do the stomps. Do the big gear, maximum effort, short work. But just take more rest. Take longer rest, and this is more of that strength work type of thing. Don't go out and try to mimic a criterium in the middle of February. Pick apart the reason why you're having trouble in that criterium and train each individual aspect. That's going to allow you to incorporate more of that high intensity work into your winter training, and it will get you a better result at the end of the day in terms of improving that weak area. So not less specific, okay? You're taking that weakness, you're pulling it apart into all of its different aspects and training them individually. That is kind of the weakness part of it, an abbreviated weakness training seminar there. So you can send in some questions for that. And we're going to move on to endurance training. So endurance training, remember, not base training. We're talking about endurance training. What we're doing when you're trying to improve your endurance, okay, is we're talking about 4 main physiological adaptations. And I basically have 3 slides here. I'm going to go through these, and then we'll have a little discussion on putting them all together. So when you think about endurance, we're talking about, very simply, the ability to go longer with less fatigue. Okay? So we're talking about 4 major adaptations. The first one, which is incredibly important, which a lot of people don't think about, is better neurological function, or better neurological durability, as I call it. And one of the examples I like to use is Fabian Cancellara is one of the best time trialists in the world. And one of the reasons for that is that he can produce a lot of power on the bike. That is certain. But the other thing is that his neurological system, his leg muscles and neurological system is far more efficient at pedaling in that position around that circle than probably anyone else listening right now. And I've gotten into arguments with this with some people before, and you know, they say that your feet are attached to the pedals and they go around that fixed circle no matter what, which is very true. But the way in which your muscles activate and push those pedals around that circle can be very different. And so one of the things that you're working on when you're doing those long rides and you're doing that endurance training is better neurological function, better efficiency, you can think of it. Another one is increased mitochondrial density, right? Mitochondria are those things in your cells. They produce energy. The more of them you have, the less tired you get, the longer you can go. Number 3 is capillary density. Probably all the roadies know about this one. The more of those long rides you do, your body grows more capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels in your body. The more of those you have, the more oxygen, the more glucose you get to your muscle cells, the more waste that's removed, the less tired you get. And the last one, which is really important, especially for the real long distance people and the long distance triathletes, is the ability to burn more fat at higher intensities. If you take a very efficient cyclist, and they will be able to burn a pretty high percentage of fat for energy riding, you know, at tempo at very relatively high intensities. If you take that same cyclist and you have him play tennis, they're not used to that. They're not good at that. They're going to burn 100% glucose all the time. They would be horrible. They'd be very inefficient at doing that. So especially for the longer distance athletes, if you're doing Ride the Rockies or you're doing the Latoja bike race or an Ironman, this becomes a really important factor. Also for the road cyclist, you got a high intensity finish. You want to have, you know, extra sugar available to be able to produce that effort level at the end of the race. All of these things happen. All of these endurance adaptations happen more. They happen at an increased rate after the 70-minute mark. Okay, and this is how we're going to define long. One of the parameters of defining long. Now, about this 70-minute mark, this isn't necessarily a switch that just turns on, and the 71-minute and 72-minute is 10 times as valuable as the minute before that. Some people might have heard that you have to do 20 minutes of continuous exercise to get any aerobic benefit. There's a bunch of studies out there that were done with runners saying that, some people probably have heard that if you're doing a workout that's 90 minutes long or less, then you don't need to take in any fuel. You don't need to drink a sports drink. If you're doing a workout that's 90 minutes or longer, then you do need to do that. I've read some studies that talk a lot about the 70 minutes of continuous work. And the thing that we're getting at here is that longer is better, definitely, but it has to be repeatable. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And you have to get away from this 1 hour limit. Our lives, at some point, I don't know when, some point someone decided that our lives should be broken up into hour-long segments. Lunch break is an hour, spinning classes are an hour, meetings are an hour, this webinar is an hour, everything in our lives is an hour. You need to get rid of that mindset, okay? For my athletes, when they're doing endurance work, especially in the wintertime, I really try to have them push to go beyond that 70-minute mark. Try to get that 90-minute ride in. When we're doing something else, it can be less than an hour. Ask any one of the triathletes that I work with, and they'll tell you that they do very few runs that are an hour long. They're usually shorter, and they're either shorter because they want to increase their repeatability, or there's some intensity, or they're longer. I'm not going to give you a quote-unquote long run that's an hour. It's going to be 90 minutes or more maybe. So get away from that 1 hour mark. So what is long? We have to define long. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to try to go over that 70 minutes of continuous work. And it has to be repeatable. I'm going to say this a couple of times between now and the end of the webinar. Consistency is king. If you cannot be consistent with what you are doing, it doesn't matter how great of a workout it is, how perfect of a workout it is not going to do you any good unless you can have consistent training. And this is where these people that they do some big crazy 5-hour hammer ride on Saturday, or they do a 2.5-hour run on the weekend. And my question is, that's great. So what did you do the day after that? What did you do for 2 days after that? So there's a definite bit of a catch-22 there with trying to break down those barriers, trying to do those big workouts, and maintain consistency. So another couple of ways I like to define what's long and what can be consistent is if you're doing an easier endurance ride, something that's down in zone 2, you can be recovered by tomorrow. And you can get back out there, no problem. Might not even feel tired from the day before. If it's a little bit harder, if there's some more intensity in there in a longer endurance ride, then you can be recovered within a couple of, 2 days max. And that doesn't mean you're not going to train within 2 days, but you should be recovered from that workout. And another one that I like to do is you have the ability to do some kind of intensity inside of a long workout and maintain repeatability. So yes, definitely some of the higher category riders that might be on this call, they say, well, I've done 4-hour bike races even longer, and there's a lot of intensity in there. Well, sure, but when you do that, you're completely destroyed the next day. So one of my favorite kind of workouts is to have people do is to have them warm up, do an abbreviated threshold workout, maybe 3 by 8 minutes or 3 by 10 minutes, take a little bit of time to recover, and then finish out a 3-hour bike ride in zone 2. So kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone there. But that would be, I'm able to do that intensity inside of what this long, quote unquote, long workout is. I can do that ride. I can do 3 hours of threshold, or 3 by 10 minutes of threshold in a 3-hour ride and be okay the next day. I can go out and train. But if I go to 4 hours or 5 hours and I'm doing threshold intervals, it gets to be very challenging. And the last part about this is how do we want to go about maximizing this time? So, okay, you defined endurance training. We're defining what long is for myself and my goals. One of the things that some people don't realize is that the higher aerobic power that you ride, the faster and the more of these endurance adaptations you're getting. So to clarify, if you're riding at your lactate threshold or below, you're getting endurance adaptations. Some people think that doing tempo rides or doing those sweet spot intervals or threshold intervals like that, you're not getting endurance adaptation, and you are. Now, the catch to that is the higher intensity you ride, the more fatigue you build, and you can't do it for as long, and it becomes not quite as repeatable. Makes sense. So we don't want to affect our repeatability too much here. We still want to make sure that we're getting out there for every day, 5 days a week, whatever your goal is for workouts in a given week. In terms of endurance training, we want to make sure that we can go long. We want to make sure that we can go over that 70-minute mark, that we're getting out there doing 90 minutes plus of riding, for example. And so this last statement, zone 3 or tempo, this 1 notch below threshold, is the best place to maximize your endurance training time. And I want to focus on endurance and time in that statement. This is not to say that you should just go out and do tempo rides all the time. But it does mean that when you are time crunched, that riding at tempo, riding in zone 3, is going to get you a lot of bang for your buck. and it becomes repeatable. You can warm up for 15 minutes, do an hour tempo, cool down for 15 minutes, and you can do that a couple days in a row even. And you're keeping that ride short. You don't need to go do a 3 or 4 hour ride when, frankly, you don't have time to. If it's dark, it's cold, it's icy, all those kinds of things. So, again, think about those endurance adaptations, what you're actually trying to get with your endurance training, these adaptations, trying to define long for you and your goals, okay? Consistency is paramount. If you can't be consistent with your training in general, then it doesn't matter what you're doing. It's not going to work. If you get injured, if you get burnt out, if you have to take a month and a half off because of either one of those things, then it's not going to be nearly as effective. And this, the tempo area, this is maximizing your time. When you're time crunched, this is the place to go. You can do threshold intervals in the winter. It's okay. You'll get great adaptation. You'll gain endurance, okay? Another thing about endurance training that a lot of people don't realize is that you're always getting some kind of residual endurance training if you're doing your sport. And I'll use kind of a strength workout. If you were going out and doing some sprints with long rest, that doesn't, people think that's not really an endurance workout. But there's a couple of things. First of all, you're warming up, you're cooling down, you're taking rest intervals, you're riding, you're getting endurance adaptation there. Okay. The other thing is, if you look at number 1 here on the endurance adaptations that you're getting, better neurological function and durability, the harder you ride, the higher power outputs that you produce, the more neurological activity you're recruiting, the more muscle fibers you're recruiting. So when you're doing those maximum effort sprints or stomps or strength work on the bike, you're doing neuromuscular training. You're increasing that neuromuscular power. You're improving number 1 here on the endurance training adaptations. So it's very counterintuitive, and some people have some hard time wrapping their head around this, but doing maximum effort sprints, doing strength or power work on the bike is a type of endurance training. It's a different type of endurance training, but it is endurance training in a way. So I got a couple of power files here that they're going to be up, and you can look at them in the TrainingPeaks viewer. But I have these slides up here that I made, and the yellow is power output. And again, these are not to tell you that one type of training is better than another type of training. It's just illustrating that intensity is a tool that you can control to maximize your endurance adaptations, to maximize your endurance training. Time, we do not have control over how much time we have. A lot of the times, like I said, it gets dark, we have jobs and lives, we don't have control over how much time we have to train. But we do have control over our intensity. You control that 100%. So this is an example of a team ride, a group ride that I did with a bunch of teammates. This was a couple years ago. The ride was 3 hours and 40 minutes, and that's riding time. That doesn't include waiting for George to show up or whatever. And I did 2,100 kilojoules in that ride, averaged about 163 watts. Now, if you're not a power guru, you don't know what kilojoules are, it's a measurement of total workload. So you can think of kilojoules as endurance training points, if you will. And you can see by this power output, there's a lot of drafting time here. There was definitely some hard riding that we did. And there was a lot of coasting time. There was a lot of drafting time, a lot of time riding in zone 1 at a very low intensity. And I did 560 kilojoules an hour. On this next slide, this was a tempo ride that I did by myself. And this is actually, I did this on my time trial bike, I think. And you can see there's a warm-up here in the beginning, and then a nice steady tempo effort. I think this was about an hour and 45 minutes long, and then a cool down. This ride was only 2 hours, and I did 1,862 kilojoules. I did almost the same amount of workload in a 2-hour ride as I did in a 3-hour ride. The group ride was less than 600 kilojoules an hour, right? It was 540, I think I said. And then the steady tempo ride, I did almost 900 kilojoules an hour. And I've given Melissa the links to these, so they should be for public view, and it's up on my personal TrainingPeaks account, and you can check them out and look at the TSS and all that kind of stuff. The tempo ride that I gave you, Melissa, is actually a different file than this one. It's not the exact file. This file I lost or something happened. But it is a tempo ride, and so the time will be a little bit different. The kilojoules will be different on that tempo ride, but the lesson is the same. You're getting a lot more total workload done in a lot less time. So you can look at that and highlight certain sections and play around with that in that viewer. So a couple of things just to wrap up. Intensity, as I said, intensity is a tool that you can control to increase your training load. We don't have control over how much time that we have a lot. So use intensity as a tool to do that. Endurance adaptation is a function of time and intensity. So you want to think workload. Lower intensity does not mean you're getting better endurance. Okay? And as I said before, it's kind of a catch-22. The long workouts are great. The higher intensity is great, but you can't do too much of both of them at once. Otherwise, you're going to get way too tired much too quickly. It'll affect your repeatability. So common sense thing here is a lot of people are probably thinking, I'll do harder workouts when I have less time during the week. And then on the weekend, when I go out, if it's nice out, hopefully, and I can get out, ride with the team, that's when I can do my longer workouts. I'm not here to tell you any magical way to train, but putting all this stuff together so that you have these tools so that you can maximize how much time that you have is the way to go. So again, low intensity does not mean better endurance. This is something that a lot of people think. It's not necessarily true. Time means long, so the more time you have, those long workouts are great. They're really, really key. If you want to do well at that Ironman, if you want to go to the Tour of the Gila and do well, you have to do those long workouts, absolutely. But it also means total training load from now until your race day. So don't get too much tunnel vision on, I got to do a 5-hour ride on Saturday. Think, I need to do as much training load as possible between now, the day that I start my training, January 8th, all the way to my race day, which might be in May, it might be in June, or it might be next year. So think about that big picture. Think about that total workload. I was just talking to, before we did this here at TrainingPeaks headquarters, I was just talking to a really fantastic mountain biker, and he's been racing in mountain biking for 10 plus years, and he was telling me how he's not going to have as much time this year to train, but he turned around and said, I don't need as much time anymore because I have 10 years of base training. I have 10 years of endurance workout in me. That endurance training builds up over time, over weeks, months, even years. That's why you see those 30-plus-year-old guys doing so well at the big stage races. That's why you see the 30-plus, 35-plus guys doing so well at the long-distance Ironmans, at the longer-distance triathlons. It's because they've been doing endurance workouts. They've been training consistently for years. And that kind of stuff builds up. A couple other things to think about. This is all about you, much more so than your race. And I get this question all the time. Eric, I'm doing an Ironman. What should I do? Well, what are your goals at the race? I have 2 clients that are doing Ironman Lake Placid this year. One of them has the goal to qualify. One of them has the goal to finish. Completely different training. People say, oh, I want to do cyclocross because I don't need to train that much. Well, if you want to win, you do. You're going to have to train a lot if you want to win at the top end of that sport. Same thing with longer races. Longer races doesn't necessarily mean longer training. Best way to prepare. You have to think more personally. You have to think about your goals, your background, all of your resources, what are your strengths and weaknesses, things like that. Races do not require a minimum amount of training time. Your goals require a minimum amount of training. Do focus blocks. You can focus on a particular sport for triathletes. I do a lot of this with my triathlon athletes. Focus on a particular skill and a particular zone. A lot of times when people are trying to, for the Tour of the Gila, for example, which is a big stage race, if I have an athlete that's trying to do well in the GC they're trying to do well overall, one of the things I'll have them do is the only time I have them do threshold intervals, specific threshold intervals, is on their time trial bike on flat roads, flat rolling terrain. So now we're working on their time trialing and their threshold power at once. That's also specific to the race. That time trial is about 40 minutes long, give or take. That's a threshold effort. We don't even bother doing hill threshold because there's just not enough time. So that's a way that you can really focus in on a particular skill set and a particular energy zone. Don't do your threshold intervals on Wednesday when you did the group ride on Tuesday and you're going to do hill intervals on Wednesday or hill intervals on Thursday. Doing that kind of thing might get you very fit, but it lacks being specific. Do your threshold work. Take a month and just focus on threshold. Have fun. Plan ahead, right? Find races, other events, things that can be good training, and incorporate those into the training that you're doing. So you might be working on, for example, you might be doing a lot of strength work in February, but at the end of February, say you go on a team training trip or a training trip with a bunch of your friends to a warm climate, and all you're going to do for a week is stretch and eat and train. Well, that's a great opportunity to do a lot of volume. So leave the strength training on the back burner. You can pick it up later. That's a great opportunity to get in a lot of volume. So you can plan on things like that, fit that into your training. The standard periodization, of doing more volume endurance training and then building to higher intensity work is a good one. But it doesn't have to be done all at once, and it doesn't only have to be done one time. I've had people focus on a big race in May, and I've had them go through that kind of standard periodization 2 or 3 times before that race. So plan for these events, go ahead and do them, even if they might not fall into what you would think of as a standard periodization. Take advantage of those things. Keep your training fun and keep your training dynamic. And that's about it. So we can take any questions that we might have. I think we have a pretty big list over there.
Yeah, we do. Okay, and we'll see how much time we have for these questions, but we got a good amount of really good questions for you. So the first one is, how long do you recommend warming up in winter or in cold temperatures? Do you need to warm up longer than normal?
That's a great question. Warming up can be a really personal thing, and a lot of people tend to find that the older they get, the longer they need to warm up. When I was in college, I would drink 8 ounces of coffee and just let it rip. I wouldn't warm up at all. But now I need a long time to warm up. I think, yes, you might need longer to warm up in cold weather. Sometimes if it's really cold out and I'm going to work out outside, I'll actually warm up inside. I'll do some abs or some core work or some stretching or kind of some dynamic muscle activation stuff and actually get warm and then go outside. I think even more so that your warm-up is going to depend on your workout. If you're going to do a high-intensity workout outside, then you're probably going to need a fair bit of warm-up time. But if you're just going to go out and do an endurance ride outside, you might, not necessarily need a lot of warm-up. So yes, I think you might need a little more warm-up in cold weather, especially if it is going to be an intense workout. Then you definitely want to make sure that you get in plenty of warm-up time.
Okay, thanks. This next one, these first 2 questions are regarding cold air, which seems so appropriate given our temperature last week.
Yeah.
But the next question is, if air temperature is very cold, is it better to not breathe too deeply or intensely?
I would say that if you're talking about some extreme cold weather, if it's 10 degrees, you probably don't want to go outside and do really hard threshold intervals. You're going to be you still could do it. There are some people who don't have a problem with it. You're just going to find you're going to have trouble with it. There's definitely going to be probably a lack of performance. If it's really uncomfortable, then I would just recommend that you don't do it. If you're not comfortable and riding hard and whatever the temperature is, I know people that don't want to go outside and ride if it's below 40, then don't do that. Ride inside. And a lot of people now, you see a lot of cyclists nowadays wearing neck warmers or neck gaiters like skiers wear. And I think that goes a long way. We've seen a lot of that even in the pro races, like you've seen on TV, some of them throwing one of those on after a stage to keep that throat warm, to keep their throat and their jaw as warm as possible, to help warm that air so it's not totally up to the lungs. So.
Cool, thanks. You mentioned the 70-minute mark. This person asking the question has heard after 3 hours you get diminished results. Is that true? What's your thought on that?
That's a really good question. My answer is no, that is not true, but it's going to be individualized, okay? Fabian Cancellara does not get diminished returns after a 3-hour bike ride. I can guarantee it, okay? And there's plenty of great cyclists, great triathletes that do not get diminished returns past the 3-hour mark. However, if you're brand new to cycling and you've never even ridden over 90 minutes before, going out and riding for 4 hours is probably going to have a diminishing returns. And that might have been something I should have brought up when I talk about the repeatability. So when you're trying to find out what that breaking point is for you as an individual, you want to look to that repeatability as to what is too long, what is giving you a diminished returns. And I think the first thing you want to look at is repeatability. The second thing you can look at is how much longer than your average long workout or your longest workout is it. If you normally only ride for 3 hours max, doing a 6-hour bike ride all of a sudden is going to be more of a mental challenge and maybe give you more of a mental lift than a physical one. So that's a really good point. It's going to be individualized. Yeah, it's going to be individualized for sure.
Is it any different for trainers, like riding on the trainer inside, like a long ride?
I think it's more of a mental thing than anything. But again, riding on the trainer inside should be easier. And I know a lot of people are scratching their head and going, what? But it should be easier because you don't have to stabilize your bike. You don't have to deal with environmental conditions. If you do 200 watts outside and you're doing 200 watts inside, it should be the same. The problem is when people ride outside is they spend a lot of time coasting or going easier. Their brain is a lot more, you're much more engaged in the weather and your route and the surface of the road and stuff like that. So no, there's no calculation, and I've heard this a lot. Yeah, you can do a 3-hour ride outside or a 90-minute ride inside. No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. So for the bike, you talk about training with power. What do you use for running to measure intensity? Heart rate, pacing? What do you recommend?
I recommend both of those things along with a very as accurate of a perceived exertion as possible. And we talked a little bit about this when I did the Ironman race execution webinar. Your intensity is, when you're measuring intensity, it's made up of 3 things. It's made up of your perceived exertion, 1. It's made up of your heart rate, 2. Those are 2 really good ways to measure your perceived exertion. Both of those things are reactive. They're reactive to what you're actually doing. On the bike, what you're actually doing is measured in power, is measured in watts. when you're running, that's going to be measured in pace. Pace is not as good as power because your pace is going to be indicative of the terrain that you're on. So if you're running up a steep hill, you might only be running in zone 2, but it could be you're really at threshold because you're running uphill. So you want to use a combination of all of those things. I like for athletes to use heart rate, have a good sense of perceived exertion, and use pace. And we take the course that they're running on into account. An example is, for the people that live out here in Colorado, Magnolia Road is kind of a notorious running road. And it's a dirt road. It's at about 8,500 feet in altitude, and it's extremely hilly. And if you go run up there, you'll end up averaging a zone 2 pace, but your effort level will be extremely high. I'll do a 90-minute run up there, and I'll be running, it'll be essentially a 90 minutes as hard as I can, and I'll average somewhere in zone 2 pace. So you have to take the terrain into account with pace, but I like to use all of those things.
All right. So we just have a couple more questions here for you. Can you address riding and training in your sweet spot versus Empower Zone 3 when time is limited?
Yeah. So the sweet spot intervals, as they're called by some, is, for those that don't know, it comes out to being at the low end of Zone 4, so at the low end of your threshold, or at the higher end of Zone 3. And so it's sweet spot intervals as opposed to doing tempo intervals. They're not going to be that different. It's a little bit of a higher intensity. I mean, if someone were to, I've had, I say do an hour at tempo, and they end up riding at the upper end of Zone 3, at the upper end of their tempo zone, when they're in their sweet spot zone. So those sweet spot intervals is just more of a, narrowed down. It's more of a narrowed down zone instead of saying ride anywhere in Zone 3 or ride anywhere in threshold. They like that that sweet spot has been defined because of you get great adaptation there for the amount of time that you spend. You get great endurance adaptation. You get adaptations to your thresholds. You can increase your threshold power by spending enough time there, doing enough intervals there. But you can recover fairly quickly. You're not building up any lactate on the muscles. You're not doing any muscle damage. So, you can do sweet spot intervals, and if you have a good day and you're taking care of yourself, you might not even be that fatigued the following day, depending on how many minutes of them you do. It's just sweet spot is just a more defined, a more narrowed down zone. I don't necessarily use that term, but I'll tell people to do intervals at the upper end of Zone 3 or at the low end of Zone 4.
Okay. So this one was asked by a handful of people. Do you have recommendations on how to increase the burn fat percent, whether that's through diet or exercise? And I know this is a loaded question, but it was asked by a couple people, so it'd be interesting to hear. It's a loaded question in the sense that there's a lot of factors there's a lot of things at play here. And, personally, I would like to know more. I would like to do more research on this topic to find out how trainable it really is. It's been my understanding in the past that it's actually not, it's not that trainable in the sense that it takes a very long time to get that type of adaptation. But there's some newer research that might suggest that is incorrect. I know that, what's his name, the manager of Garmin Slipstream, the Garmin team. Botters.
Yeah, Jonathan Botters has his guys do a notorious workout like once a month or something where they eat normally on day 1, and then when they wake up on day 2, they can only have water or black coffee, no sugar, no nothing. They go out, they warm up quickly and do an hour as hard as they can. essentially completely bonked. That is an extremely, I wouldn't have, an amateur or new athlete do that. That's definitely a high level workout. How much adaptation are they getting from doing that once a month? I don't know. I know that, for example, that's one ability that I have is very good on myself, and the other athletes that have been tested that I know of that have very good fat metabolism, that can metabolize a high percentage of fat at relatively high intensities, is they've been doing their sport for a long time, years. And so I think that the consistent training, the consistent long workouts is probably one of the most key things in terms of training that fat metabolism. Something important to realize about that, when you are at your lactate threshold, when you are riding at your lactate threshold, you are burning 100% glycogen. And that's a fact for everybody. It's too high of an intensity. You're using energy too quickly to burn fat. And so that's kind of the breaking point there. When you come down below threshold, that's when your body can start using more and more fat for energy, because it doesn't need as much energy. It takes a lot longer to break down fat for energy, so that's why that happens. And that's actually one of the myths about the whole fat burning zone. If you want to burn fat during your workout, your heart rate needs to way down here. The reason why you can burn more fat for energy at that lower intensity is because it's a lower intensity. You don't need as much energy. Most of the people here, I'm sure, are looking to increase performance. And so for all of you, you're looking to burn more fat at a higher intensity, not just burn fat. Losing weight, sometimes I've talked about kind of weight loss in this webinar, and weight loss is, we won't get into it, but it's you're looking at more calories in, calories out. You can't work in a specific heart rate and burn fat instead of burning sugar. So yeah.
All right, great. Well, it looks like that's all the time we have for questions. As I said in the beginning, we are recording this webinar, so it's going to be up on YouTube. It also will be on our webinar page. And we'll send an email out. It'll probably go out tomorrow, and it will have a link to the uploaded webinar. It'll also have a link to those 2 files that Eric mentioned. And I quickly just want to mention the other webinars we have going on this month. We've got 2 other ones that kind of go hand in hand with what Eric spoke about today, and those are addressing different parts of the off-season, how to keep the off-season interesting, and then we also have one with Dave Scott later on in the month. And then we have a 3rd webinar coming up, and it's going to be on eating paleo. So I know that's a really interesting topic for a lot of our athletes, and I highly recommend that you guys take a look at those webinars, and even if you can't attend them, register for them, and you can get access to the online recording. So with that, thank you, Eric, for a great webinar.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And everyone, have a great day.